Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to apologise to begin with. I think this is probably going to be one of the Eagle Ski Club talks that has the least amount of skiing in it, but I hope that we're going to be able to bring it back around to skiing, certainly towards the end, because I think the lessons that, or the things that I've learned through climbing and skiing in the mountains over the last couple of decades work just as well for alpine climbing as they do for skiing. Now, I'm going to do a very un-British thing, and I'm going to tell you all that I've done lots and lots of climbing, and I'm not going to be shy about that. I think there's something that we tend to do as particularly British climbers and skiers, where we all like to suggest that we've never been climbing before, and it's just fluke that we've managed to climb something. Whereas I'm going to tell you that I've done lots and lots of climbing over the last few years, well, really the last 20 years, whether that's alpine climbing here in Chamonix or going away to the sort of bigger mountains, as well as lots of rock climbing. That's a real passion of mine. The reason that I say that now is because I'm going to spend the first 10 minutes of this telling you about all the times that I've gone on trips and failed to do any climbing at all, or got shut down or ran away for a whole host of reasons. What I'm going to talk about for most of this talk is alpine climbing. For lots of you, you'll already know what that involves. For those of you who are new to the sport or are really ski focused, what we're talking about is climbing mountains in teams of 2 or 3, carrying everything that we're going to use on the trip with us, trying to leave nothing on the mountains. There's no fixed ropes. And usually we're climbing mountains that are a little bit bigger, like the mountain in the picture here. And this is Chamonix in the background. That's on an ascent of a route called the British route on the Sandstorm face. So for those of you who know the mountains around Chamonix reasonably well, if you look up at the Dru and the Aiguille Verte, there's a nice wall between the two. And this was a route climbed at the beginning of December a few years ago. And we're just approaching the summit here. We'd woken up early in the morning, climbed through the dawn, through the day. We were just topping out as it started to go dark. And being early December, taking advantage of just a short break in the weather, it felt like we were the only ones in the entire massive Alp climbing. It was an amazing experience to have what can be quite busy mountains to ourselves. But that sort of encapsulated what it means to have the perfect alpine day for me, climbing with one good friend, really beautiful route that was challenging. We climbed up, abseiled down the other side, and got back to the hut about 24 hours after we'd set off. It was a fantastic day out. However, there's lots of times when it doesn't all go to plan and we don't end up climbing what we set off to do. The first one I was going to talk about here is the north face of the Dru, which a friend of mine, Rich, and I attempted early in January a few years ago. As you can see, there's absolutely loads and loads of snow. I think that there was 2 things going on. We didn't get much higher than where Rich is now. One, in the conditions that we found it, the climbing was really quite difficult and time consuming, and we were just too optimistic about how quick we could move, and we ended up running away. This photo is from a route where I have sort of mixed feelings about the success or the failure of the trip, depending on how you look at it. On the one hand, this photo is taken on a route called Deprivation, which is on the north buttress of Mount Hunter in Alaska. So a big 1,200 meter high north facing snow and ice route that leads up to another 600 meters to the summit. On this occasion, I think we kind of got our planning a little bit wrong and ended up bailing not too far above the top of this photo, where we hit the sort of the snow slopes that lead to the summit. And while we were very pleased at the time to have got to the top of the buttress, I think with better planning and possibly a little bit more in the way of sort of drive or forethought, we could have made it to the top of the mountain, which would have made the whole thing a much more of a fulfilling experience and would have really sort of made it feel like a total success. And sometimes the conditions just don't play at all. So this is a photo of the Aviano Towers, which is in northern Patagonia. I went there with a group of friends 7 or 8 years ago, and our trip was a month long. We spent a week getting to the base of the valley underneath this mountain. We then spent 3 or 4 days carrying all of our haul bags up to the base of the route. We climbed a few pitches and fixed some ropes, went back to our tents, and then it stormed for pretty much the rest of the trip. And we carried all of our bags back down from the wall, carried the loads down through the jungle, back across the lake and out. So for our month-long expedition, we perhaps climbed 5 or 6 pitches of climbing. But that being said, it was still one of the best trips that I've ever been on, because we went to an amazing place with a really nice group of people and felt like we were doing something that was really quite exploratory, even though, once again, we didn't get to do much climbing. Here's another less than successful trip where we were trying to climb a new route on the north face of a 6,000 meter peak called Kyajo in Nepal. This is sort of just below Gokyo, for those of you that have been trekking around the Everest region. And we spent two days trying to get up here. We spent a day up to a bivouac, a little bit above my friend's head at the top of the snow, and another half a day climbing the mixed ground up onto the ridgeline. It got a little bit higher than that, and I took my rucksack off and clipped a sling through what I thought was the shoulder strap and clipped it to the belay. Unfortunately, the sling wasn't through the shoulder strap, it was through another strap that was tucked in. So as I hung my rucksack there, it disappeared off into space, which left us several hundred meters up a north face at just under 6,000 meters without a stove. Cue lots of abseiling. And probably a failure that I see as one of the more spectacular, one of the more unfortunate of all of the things that I've tried to do in the mountains, which is the reverse traverse of the Chamonix-based, which is something that doesn't get climbed very often, but something that we thought might be a good option to do in a sort of very hot region time, because we could climb mostly on ridges and be away from rockfall. Unfortunately, as you can see by the picture on the right, a big chunk of the route, unbeknown to us or anybody else who'd been, as this route hadn't been climbed for quite a long time, had fallen down. So instead of finding perfect granite, we actually found all of these shattered ledges and what was ground that we really couldn't pass through. And on this occasion, having abseiled over from the Chamonix side of the ridgeline down onto the Mer de Glace side of the face here, we felt that we were in such a sort of like precarious position because of the massive rockfall that we were going to ask for help from outside, and PGHM came and picked us up in a helicopter. Now, that's something that's happened to a lot of my friends, and I've often thought, come on now, if you're not hurt, you can get out of this. But it really was a situation where I felt that the safest thing for us to do would be for us to ask for that outside assistance before we really needed it. And I think that's the one time in my entire mountaineering career that I've needed to ask for that outside assistance. And for me, that is the biggest failure, because you've sort of taken away from that independence that you rely on. And sometimes things just don't work out at all. So this is a photo from a trip to the Indian Himalaya from just last year, where we went to try and climb a route on a mountain called Barnage 2, an unclimbed 6,500 meter peak in the Kishtwar Valley in northwest India. Unfortunately, on this occasion, having tried one route on a different mountain and been sent back by heavy snowfall, my partner Dave picked up a bad chest infection. So once again, a trip where we don't get to climb what we want to climb, but get to go to an amazing place, have a pretty special experience. Now, you might think I've just rattled through loads and loads of ways that things have gone wrong and we've failed to climb routes. And that's true, but it made me sort of reflect on, what does success actually mean in the mountains? And a line that I've heard many times, I'm not sure who it's attributed to, is that you should come back alive, come back friends, and get to the top in that order of importance. And with that sort of in mind, I sort of thought about, what's the recipe for success for trying to go and have really positive experiences in the mountains? I think there's some sort of key ingredients. You need the time to be able to go and do these things. Often it takes, both in the preparation and going away on big trips, it could be as much time as you've got for preparation, and then for a lot of the trips to the further away places, many weeks or months to get things done. You need really good partners, and you need the conditions to work in your favor in the mountains, but also you need to be in good shape to make it happen. Like, in terms of having the time and resources to do these things, it's much easier to get away when you're in your 20s doing seasonal jobs and having lots of free time to go and hang out in Chamonix and go climbing and then go off on expeditions. But I'm always super impressed by the Mick Fowlers and the Paul Ramsdens of the world, who managed to seem to fit around doing these amazing mountaineering expeditions to big 6,000 and 7,000 meter peaks in their sort of short annual holidays. Now, of course, there's professionals who sort of professional athletes who are paid to go on these trips. But for most of us, it's sort of finding time in our busy schedules, managing to put aside a bit of time in from our holidays to go and do it, and then finding the cash to pay for the trips. Now, I think if you want to go and climb an 8,000 meter peak, it's way in excess of £10,000 to go and do that. Whereas a lot of the sort of more exploratory or smaller trips, particularly away to somewhere like Alaska or the lower peaks in the Himalaya, can be done for £3,000 or £4,000, which sounds like quite a lot of money. However, we're really lucky in the UK to have the Mount Everest Foundation and the Alpine Club, British Mountaineering Council, who all have grants available to help particularly younger climbers get away to go and try more exploratory routes. And I'm certainly very grateful for them for making it possible for me to go away on some of the trips, particularly when I was younger, doing my first trips away. The next thing you need is really good partners. And I think when I was younger, I'd quite often, particularly in Scotland or in the Alps, tie on with anybody where I could find who was keen to go and try and do the same thing. And sometimes that worked out really well and I made lifelong friends. And sometimes it didn't work out quite as well. But I think what's really important is that it's people that you really get on with, people you trust, and people who you can get on with well when things go badly wrong or it's really stressful. And I also think that if you're going to go and do something which is big, hard, scary, and potentially dangerous, you need people who can get you out of a situation if you really need them. So you need people who you know have got skills to deal with whatever's going to come along. I think what's also really important is that the last 2 points on my slide, risk tolerance and a level of psych, match up. Simply, if you go climbing with somebody who is super keen and super enthusiastic to try and climb a big mountain, but they're willing to take risks that you're not willing to take, or vice versa, then it's a recipe for sort of disharmony in the team, and it's not going to end well for anybody. And conditions. This is the one thing that none of us can control and quite often can make or break a climbing trip somewhere. I showed lots of photos earlier on in this slideshow where we'd gone all the way across the world to go and try and climb something, and then there's no ice, too much snow, dangerous avalanche conditions, or it just doesn't work out. And then sometimes you get really lucky. So this is on a route just above where I live in Chamonix, on a route called Beyond Good and Evil, which is an old Mark Twight and Andy Parkin route from the 1990s. When this is dry, it's super difficult, but occasionally we get it so that there's snow and ice running down the runnel. And luckily, if you can get there before too many people know about it, because it is a very popular thing to do, you can have these amazing conditions where you can tack up this perfect snow and ice and climb what feels like really improbable ground at not too difficult a grade. I think a harder thing that sometimes when we fail, it's just because the thing that we're trying to do is too difficult for us. And that can be a difficult thing to accept, but sometimes that can sort of spur you on to go and try and improve whatever skills that you need to be able to get at things. I talked earlier about tolerance. for risk. And I thought about this myself. The mountain on the right of the slide is Ri, the peak I talked about earlier that we'd failed to climb. And when we went and tried this, which was maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I was quite happy as somebody in their late 20s, super psyched to try and get up to the top of the mountains, to climb a few pitches of direct ice underneath the massive ice cliff to the right of the mountain, because it seemed justifiable. To my mind, it was only going to take us a few minutes to climb up underneath the ice cliffs, and then we'd be away. However, undoubtedly, that's taken quite a big gamble to do that. Whereas when we came to the mountain on the left, Barnage 2, last year, I was totally unwilling to climb up underneath the seracs that would have given access to the north face. Whereas some younger guys who were young, super keen, were willing to take that risk and climbed a sort of a really brilliant, but I thought reasonably, objectively dangerous line. I also talked about sort of psychological conditioning for a sort of a trip. On a trip to Patagonia that I went on a few years ago, by the time I got there, I really didn't feel that I was super psyched and motivated. And one of the reasons for that, I think, was that in the previous few months, I'd had a pretty scary experience, which was the photo on the left, where we'd spent about 24 hours in a pretty big storm, finding our way up and off the top of the north face of the Grand Jurass and making the descent in pretty wild conditions that felt like a little bit too much of a close escape. And not long after that, my friend Adrian here on the right had taken a massive fall while we were climbing in Morocco, stripped all of the gear out of the pitch he was leading, and smashed himself up pretty well. And we'd sort of self-rescued back down to the road before we could get away. And I think sometimes you feel like you've had enough of taking chances, or you've been through the ringer a little bit, and perhaps what you need to do is go away and go sport climbing and have a bit of psychological recovery. And I think also alpine climbing, particularly, it's cold, sometimes it's scary, occasionally it's dangerous, it's definitely hard work. You have to really want to do it, otherwise you're just going to get to the bottom of the hard climbing, it's going to be uncomfortable, and you're going to run away. And some people have got an endless, bottomless well of desire. But I think for most of us, we need to recharge our batteries every now and again to make sure that we're fully psyched. So I thought I would talk a little bit about a trip that I went on a few years ago where it all went to plan. And we had really good conditions, particularly for our main objective. And I was there with some really good friends, and we got to successfully get to the top of a mountain doing something that we were pleased to have done. I was lucky to be climbing with two good friends of mine. This is Pete Graham at the top of Ben Nevis, having just climbed a route called the Shield Direct, which cuts up a mixed route that cuts up one of the steepest parts of the Carl-Morgerrig buttress. Now, Pete's an excellent person to go away with on a climbing trip. He's great fun, done loads and loads of hard climbing, but he's also just super solid and very stoic, so he can get things done. And our other sort of climbing partner for that trip was Ben Sylvester. Now, Ben and Pete have been known as the Bivy brothers. And this is a photo from Ben high on Fitzroy in Patagonia on yet another bivy, or a night spent on a ledge without any, on this occasion, without any sleeping equipment at all. They'd gone light, hoping that they could tag the summit and get back down. However, on this occasion, they realized they were going to have to stop. So this is Ben folded up for the night on this ledge, waiting for it to come light. So we went away on this trip, hoping that we'd be able to climb a new route on Mount Thunder, which is the peak in the background. So we loaded everything that we were going to need for a 4-week trip into a plane, got dropped off on the glacier, started to have a look around, and then quickly identified, sort of on the buttress to the right of the photo, a line that we thought could lead to the summit. Unfortunately, we quickly realized that the conditions were more what you'd hope to find if you were going to go steep skiing than if you were going to go and try and climb. You can see lots and lots and lots of thick snow plastered onto the buttress, which made it both quite hard going, but also quite dangerous. Got to the stage where you can see the big snow mushrooms that are formed that are really quite objectively dangerous. So we ran away, went back down, phoned for a plane and got bumped around to Denali Base Camp, where we thought we'd go for our second objective, which was to try and climb a route on Mount Foraker. Now, to get acclimatized for that, Mount Foraker is about 5,500 meters high. We knew that in order to be able to climb up there in alpine style at reasonable speed, we were going to need to be well acclimatized. So we set off to go up the normal route on Denali. To do this, we were using skis. And I have to say, whenever people ask me, of all the trips that I've been on, where would I go again? Particularly if I wanted to ski and have more of a ski mountaineering focused expedition, it'd definitely be to Denali. There's such beautiful, spectacular mountains. And even on the normal route, which has quite a lot of people on it, so you're not on your own, it can be done mostly on skis. You can sort of certainly ski up to sort of 14 camp. And for those people who are into more of the ski mountaineering and steep skiing, you can take skis higher and then ski a more direct line back to 14 camp from the summit. But you are skiing, carrying all of your gear, camping. If it snows, you can go off and ski some nice lines, sort of short lines away from camp, so you're not too hemmed in. So we skied up. This photo is taken from 14 camp. The first day we skied to 7,000 camp, the next day up to 11. Then in some bad weather, we carried some bags a little bit higher and stashed them. Then here skied up to 14 camp, all the while looking back at Mount Foraker, which was the peak that we were hoping to climb. And sort of the rib that runs down from the summit in the center of the mountain and then down to the left is the Sultana Ridge. And that's where we hoped that we'd be descending if we got a good enough weather window to climb once we were acclimatized. So we made a couple of forays higher up. This is up at 17 camp, or on the ridge that leads to 17 camp, which is the final camp that people sometimes use on the way up to the summit, looking across at Mount Foraker once again. Now, we did have a go at going up to the top of Denali. However, the weather just wasn't quite good enough. And we knew that as soon as we saw a good patch of several days of weather, we were going to ski back down to base camp, leave some stuff there, pack our light climbing sacks, and then ski around to the south face of Mount Foraker. And we're going to go and try and climb a route called the Infinite Spur, which is 2,800 meters high, cuts up this central buttress on the south face of Mount Foraker. The route perhaps being climbed 7 or 8 times before we went there. But sadly, there'd been a couple that had gone missing on it, perhaps 10 years earlier, and it hadn't been attempted since then. So we were first ones to go there for a little while. So on the first day, we packed our bags. We took 2 40-litre rucksacks and a 30-litre rucksack. And into them, we managed to fit all of the stuff that we were going to need for a 6-day round trip on the mountain. And we skied down, stashed our skis round underneath the south face, climbed up over a col and got to our first bivvy. The next day, beautiful sort of snowy mixed climbing, very similar to what we'd find in the Alps, in a truly spectacular position. Finishing on a bivvy where we managed to dig a bit of a platform out of a snow slope. We got our 2-man lightweight single skin tent and our 2 sleeping bags that we were going to share between the 3 of us. And we all got inside, tied ourselves to the mountain and tried to get some sleep. I was on the inside, Ben was in the middle, and Pete was on the outside. Unfortunately, within 2 or 3 hours, we realized that while I was sleeping soundly on the inside, that was because we were both sort of lying on top of Pete, who was pinned to the slope in his harness. realizing that we weren't going to get any rest, we decided that we'd just get up and start climbing again. The next day was a total sufferfest. We climbed for about 20 hours, climbing up long snow and ice slopes, and then up through the Black Band, which was the sort of the crux of the mountain, which had got some steep sort of exfoliating ice running through some slightly loose rock, and then up higher through the slopes. As we were coming up here, having said that the route hadn't had an ascent for 10 years, these two guys, Colin Haley and Rob Smith, who those of you who live in Chamonix or familiar with the area or follow alpine history will know as two of the sort of top American or alpinists of our generation, came past us on what was a sort of quite a light and fast ascent that they made. We had a bit of an arrangement as we were going to take a bit of a, should I say, a more slow traditional alpine approach over several days, that we'd put the track in and they'd race up behind us, overtake us 2/3 of the way up the mountain and keep going to the top once the technical climbing had been done, which they succeeded in doing, climbing the route in sort of 3.5 days out from base camp, back to base camp. So we continued up to what was a fantastic bivvy high on the mountain, where we got up to a snow crest and managed to chop off the top of the ridge so that we could get our little two-man tent up where we could stop and cook and rehydrate. And then the next day, continue up ever sort of shallowing out snow slopes to the top of the mountain, which we reached at about midnight, 3 days after we'd set off climbing. I must admit, I think for all three of us, there was a tear in our eye, as it was really quite a special moment to be up there looking out over the sort of all of the lakes off to the east, looking over these massive lakes that with the sun shining down on them, and seeing that we couldn't see any signs of human habitation for miles and miles and miles, and there was no one else around for a long way. It's a really magical moment. Looking over from the summit towards Denali, even though this was midnight, being up so far north and in the middle of this sort of, this was at the beginning of June, no, end of June. So we had 24 hours day sunlight with the sun just dipping behind the horizon and then coming back up. A little bit of a video. So, from the summit. And then us continuing on our descent down the Sultana Ridge to a bivvy. We had a final, what we hoped would be the fourth bivvy on the route, where we climbed inside a crevasse, anchored ourselves to the outside with a buried anchor, and managed to get out of what was really quite windy conditions. Unfortunately, we then got into a little bit of bad weather, which meant that we were climbing through the fog, trying to find our way down, and we ended up sleeping just for a few hours, a final time, before we made it back to our base camp. Now, for me, that climb had all of the recipes. We were lucky we had a super strong team, got on really well with each other, trusted each other to be able to make the right decisions, but also to really look after each other. I remember on our approach back to base camp, I was leading the way and I was pretty much at the end of my endurance, and we'd eaten pretty much all of the food, and I almost had a bit of a sense of humour failure. And Pete dug in his bag and found the last of the energy gels and gave it to me, which was the sort of gave the energy that I sort of needed just to pull us back up into camp. We also had plenty of time. We could hang out and we could wait for the conditions to come good. And then we were blessed with a really good weather window so that we could get up and over the mountain in a way that felt reasonably safe. So we came back safe, we got to the top, and we came back friends, and it all worked out really well. it's worth mentioning, after we'd climbed up and made it back down, Colin went back for a solo lap of the route to make the most of the tracks that we'd done, in line with him having soloed some of the other biggest routes in Alaska. However, on this occasion, the weather didn't quite play ball, and he ended up stuck high on Foraker in a storm. And we were waiting at base camp with a pretty good idea that he'd gone to go and try and climb the route solo, watching this horrific storm roll through. And he was up there with no bivy gear, not enough fuel to melt snow. And by the time he got back down, he looked pretty harrowed by the whole experience. I think that'd be an occasion where he'd say that he was successful in climbing to the top of a route, but it didn't feel like success because it had been so wildly out of control that his survival was in no way guaranteed. As we're here to think and talk about skiing, I thought about how this recipe also works when we're out ski touring in the Alps, which is something that I spend lots of time doing, both for myself and when I'm guiding groups for the Eagle Ski Club and elsewhere. And it works in just the same way, that you need to have the time to be able to do it. You need to have partners who you trust to make safe decisions when you're out in the mountains and to be able to look after each other. And you also need to have the conditions. Now, we're quite lucky that we often have good snow. And of course, you also need to have the ability and the physical and psychological conditions to be able to do things. And it made me think back to a trip that I did with the Eagles last year, where we went to the Grand Comban. Now, we had mostly brilliant conditions, with the exception of a short bit of bad weather that came in. We had a wonderful group of mixed, something that I think is super nice with the Eagle Ski Club is we often have people with mixes of experience as well as mixes of ages. And on that trip, we had some people in their 20s who it was their first real ski touring experience. And we also had 3 people in their late 60s and early 70s who were super strong and super experienced and could offer lots of advice and assistance to the younger skiers. We got to do some wonderful skiing, also got to do a bit of interesting mountaineering as we toured around the massif. And we finished off with an ascent of the Petit Comban and a ski back down, which was really fantastic. And the final thing I got to say, Kathy's very kindly already talked about the things that I'm doing with the club in the next year. And this is a photo from this year's Eagle Ski Club Mountaineering Skills for Skiers trip from earlier this summer, which I'll be running again this year. And there's a couple of places on that if anybody is interested to come out and do a little bit of climbing.
Do you have plans for the future? Have you got sort of specific climbs you're interested in doing?
I think there's always a super long list of things that I'd like to do. I'd like to, in the big mountains, I'd really like to go back to the Himalaya, and there's tentative plans to go back there in October next year, or September, October time. But other than that, it's just great to be out locally here. We're lucky to be in a place where you can get out and climb and ski lots of days, both here and sort of in the nearby mountains. And I'd admit that I really get a sort of, I love to go rock climbing for myself, but up in the mountains, climbing interesting things with clients and being able to go and help people to do things that they wouldn't think they'd be able to do, that also sort of ticks the boxes and feeds the rat a little bit. So that's good.
Cassia, you typed a question into the chat. Do you want to turn on your mic and ask?
Hi, yeah, why not, actually? Yeah, I would like to ask you, how do you feel with the pressure of failing as a pro athlete when you are sponsored?
Well, I'm not a pro athlete. I've been lucky to sort of get money from various different, from the MEF and the Alpine Club, and for quite a few of the trips that I've been on, companies might give us free clothing or whatever. But I'm very much a non-professional, keen amateur climber rather than any sort of pro.
And also, they're also happy to repeat the grants, even if you haven't submitted on few occasions. So,
Oh, yeah, totally. I think my success ratio is probably slightly less than 50% on big mountain trips, which I think is actually quite good. If I look at my sort of friends and colleagues who go off and try and do these things, just because if success was the sort of the getting to the top was the most important thing, pretty sure I could pick things that I knew I could get up. But I think it's more interesting to go and try and do things where success isn't guaranteed and you're going to try and push a little bit harder. But that means that actually getting to the top's much less likely, if that makes sense.
yeah, definitely. I just came back from Sikkim, so I'm just wondering, because I was happy
Brilliant.
to do something, but obviously there was that pressure of
Yeah.
doing.
Were you away with Tom?
Yes, correct.
Oh,
Yeah,
brilliant. It sounds like a great trip.
yeah, it
Sure would.
was lots of sitting in a tent, but it was great.
Yeah, I could have had more photos of that. There's definitely been a lot of sitting in
Oh,
tents
it's more coming. Don't
these
worry.
trips.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dave Wynne-Jones, you've got a question.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to ask about research, because somebody asked me the other day, what 3 things would you regard as the most important with an expedition? And I said research, basically.
Totally.
Because when you're going into an exploratory situation, you need to find out absolutely as much as you can. Now I'm aware that some of the things you've talked about tonight haven't been in exactly exploratory situations, so it's a slightly different sort of framework. But you were talking about first ascents in Nepal, and I mean, I've done some in China, and do you want to comment on that idea about research?
Yeah, totally. So for me, it usually starts off with having seen a photo somewhere, or somebody having said to me, I've been to this area, or there's possibilities here. And I actually keep a Word document with lots of photos and little notes from when I've read a trip report for somewhere, and it's like, sounds interesting that there's another mountain nearby that might be a good one to go and have a look at. Then get online, do some Googling, look at the Alpine Journal, which is published each year by the Alpine Club. Look at the American Alpine Journal. Try and find out who's been climbing in similar places before. A brilliant resource that we've now got is Google Earth. So when we were in the Indian Himalaya last year in the Kishtwar, we could fly around in 3D before we even got there and sort of pick out lines that we thought might be possible to climb. Sometimes that works really well, and occasionally when you get there, it looks nothing like what you're expecting to. But I think the number one piece of advice would be to talk to people who've been to the similar area before. And if they've seen your mountain, seen where you're hoping to go, then they'd be able to tell you so much more than the information that you can get from reading. And what I've universally found is that if you get in touch with people, like, we all go climbing because we're passionate about it and it's a great hobby, and people love talking about their hobbies. So if you send someone an email or phone someone up and say, 20 years ago, you went on a trip to the Kishtwar Valley, can you remember what, and ask a question, then people are only too willing to sort of have a chat about where they've been and what they saw and what they thought might be possible for future trips. And that's a really nice part of mountaineering, sort of sharing that passion with people. Yeah, does that sort of chime with your experiences, Dave?
Yeah, very, very much so. Getting in touch with people is a really good point, and it can be. I remember Lindsay Griffin talking about how, he planned an expedition to a particular area and had not allowed for the fact that he was going to arrive there in the middle of harvest time. So there were going to be no porters whatsoever available because they were all getting the harvest in, sort of thing. And the whole scheme, the whole time frame, the whole plan for the expedition basically pivoted on that and had massive problems with that. And so that's something, and it isn't going to be on Google Earth or anything like that. But as you say, it may have emerged from having been able to talk to others. But I think at the time, there hadn't been anybody going into that area. So that was the problem for him, basically. But it's been tremendously helpful to me, yeah, definitely. Going into Kyrgyzstan, it was really useful to talk to people who had tried to get in, even if they haven't succeeded, that sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. Any other questions from anyone? Will, what's your advice for younger people who are trying to build up experience to get onto harder routes?
So I think, first of all, to just get the basic skills dialed so that you can go out in the mountains to try and be safe. And there's some really sort of good ways that you can try and do that, particularly at sort of subsidized prices. So the Conville Trust, the Conville courses, which run in the Alps and in Scotland each year, they're subsidized courses for younger people under 30, where you can come along and spend 3 days with a guide and peers. There's similar levels of experience, and we'll try and teach you what you need to know to then be able to go off and hopefully be safe while you're going about building up the pyramid of experience. And then I think it does come to that pyramid of experience where if you just jump on big hard routes, you'll have a terrifying time. You probably won't get to the top, and you might not come back down either. So it's good to build up by doing lots of easier routes and then slightly harder routes and slightly harder routes. But there does come a point where you've got to sort of jump in and try the things that really inspire you. But it is all in that sort of formative years of building up the sort of different skills that you need. So if you're a really good rock climber, you do lots of climbing in the UK, but you don't know how to move together safely over easier terrain, or you don't know how to travel around on a glacier, it's worth doing a few of those sort of building routes, and then you can put it all together with your rock climbing and your ice climbing experience from Scotland, and then get onto the bigger sort of alpine and super alpine routes.
Great. I think I'm also just going to add quickly, particularly for the recording of this later, in terms of finding partners, the clubs are great. I mean, we all know that this is a club event. But
yeah, of course.
The Eagle Ski Club for skiing, the Alpine Club for climbing, or the various regional clubs in Britain around rock climbing. A lot of people seem to only see the commercial courses now. And miss out on clubs.
Totally. And so my route was very much to do a Conville course, but also to find mentors from, local climbing clubs, people that I went out with from a young age who taught me lots and lots about climbing, which was super helpful. And I know that Eagle Ski Club does have sort of subsidized places on different ski training courses, and there's various sort of training events that are really worthwhile for younger members.
Tim, you've got a question.
Yes, hello. You mentioned risk appetite.
Yeah.
So I've got two questions really relating to that. One is about your own personal risk appetite and whether you assess that or it's just a gut feeling. And secondly, when you're in a group, and you say you've got friends and you've got a similar risk appetite, you mentioned that you approached whether with a Seracs and two wanted to go up it and you didn't want to go up it. Yeah. I just wanted to know how you approach that, the consideration of risk. risk appetite, as it were, as opposed.
Yeah, so I think that your appetite for risk, well, for what I observe is that it definitely sort of changes over time as you think about the things that you did when you first went out in the mountains, partly sometimes through ignorance or partly through sort of youthful enthusiasm. You're willing to do things that in retrospect you of course wouldn't do. And I think that's partly a process of aging, or it has been for me. I'm now in my late 30s, not my early 20s, and having seen some accidents and known people who've come to people who've passed away in the mountains, it definitely makes you reflect on the fact that it is dangerous and you've got to be careful. And then in terms of how I sort of deal with that in a group, I think if I'm out climbing with friends and somebody says, I'm not happy, then we go down. And if I'm the one that's not happy, then we're going to go down, because that's the sort of the only reasonable way to work. And if I was climbing with people who didn't respect that decision in any direction, then I wouldn't choose to climb with them anymore. And I think the sort of a thing that's changed my appetite for risk and made me so much more aware about risk is that I spend my working life in the mountains guiding, and I feel that I've got a sort of a great responsibility, as I have to my partners, but to clients who are trusting me to make safe decisions about what we're going to do in the mountains. And I definitely make what I hope are ultra conservative decisions when I've got other people's safety in my hands. That helps to answer the question.
Yes, I just find it quite, because what I've noticed is that particularly with kit these days, people are they seem to misjudge risk, because I've got this type of kit, I've got a rucksack with an airbag, therefore I can do X, Y, and Z. And I'm finding people they're tending to think, oh, I can do X, Y, and Z because I've got the kit and because I've done this. I
think this is a particularly big issue in ski touring, where I don't know if you've ever been out for a little ski tour without a avalanche transceiver on, which of course we would never suggest doing, but you feel really naked and really, like, if someone said to you, would you ski that slope if you didn't have a transceiver on and you didn't have a airbag on your back? And if the answer is no, then you've got to really question why you're skiing that slope, even with all of that stuff, because I think it can sort of lull you into this sort of false sense of security, and that's something we definitely need to be aware of.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks.
Right, Phil, do you want to fill us in on the new Rick Allen Award, the details of that?
Yeah, it was going back to what you said about courses and things, Kathy. Because the Rick, for those of you who don't know, was a member of the Eagles and the Alpine Club, and was one of the people that Will started at the beginning talking about people that just go off a few weeks holiday every year. Rick was one of those, really, and died on K2. What was it, about 2 years ago now? Was it 2 or 3 years ago? And he's left some money in his will, actually, to various people, but including the Alpine Club. And the Alpine Club is spending it on a sort of advanced course, really, if you like. So beyond Conville, the Alpine Club also run a sort of slightly more advanced course than Conville, but the one they're going to run next summer is, I think, going to include bivouacs and something slightly harder. So it's the what phrase did you use, Will? The pyramid of experience. It's anyway, I thought I'd mention that because people may not know about it. I know it's turning into more of a climbing talk, this, but what's wrong with that?
It was pretty much a climbing talk. I think we all acknowledge that.
Yeah.